They burned the word criminal into Helen Carver's flesh and cast her into the wilderness to die. But a Comanche hunter saw what the town refused to see, tracked the real thief through blood and lies, and dragged the truth into the light Ashford Crossing, Colorado territory. Late autumn, 1883. The morning bell hadn't rung yet when the shouting began. Helen Carver jolted awake in the cramped servants' quarters behind the Ashford Mercantile, her heart already racing before her mind could catch up. The wooden walls were thin, and the voices outside cut through them like knives. She could hear boots stomping across the frozen ground, the angry buzz of a gathering crowd, and words that made her blood turn cold. Thief! Get her out here! String her up! Helen scrambled to her feet, still in her nightdress, her auburn hair tangled around her face. She pressed herself against the door, fingers trembling as she tried to steady her breath. Through the cracks in the wood, she could see torchlight flickering, shadows dancing across the dirt yard. The sky beyond was still dark, stars fading into the deep blue of pre-dawn. It couldn't have been past 5 in the morning. The door exploded inward. 2 men grabbed her by the arms before she could scream. She recognized them both. Garrett Moss, the blacksmith with hands like iron traps and a face permanently stained with coal dust, and Vernon Pike, who ran the saloon and always smelled of whiskey and cigar smoke. His breath reeked of it now as he yanked her forward. No! What are you doing? Let me go. Helen's voice cracked as they dragged her barefoot across the cold ground. Small stones bit into her solace. The frost-covered earth numbed her feet within seconds. The entire town had gathered in the square. Men, women, even children clutching their mothers' skirts, all of them staring at her with faces twisted by fury and disgust. Lanterns hung from posts, casting harsh yellow light over the scene. The air was thick with the smell of burning kerosene and something else, something metallic and ominous. In the center of the crowd stood Mayor Cornelius Ashford, a man whose family name had founded this town 30 years prior. His silver beard was perfectly trimmed, his suit immaculate despite the early hour. Gold buttons gleamed on his vest. In his hand, he held a leather satchel that Helen recognized immediately. It was hers. Her heart stopped. That satchel had been under her bed when she fell asleep last night. She kept her few belongings in it. A spare dress, a comb, a small Bible her mother had given her before she died. Nothing more. Good people of Ashford Crossing, the mayor's voice boomed across the square, silencing the murmurs. We have been violated. Betrayed by one we took in, fed, and sheltered. He lifted the satchel high, shaking it so the contents rattled. This woman, Helen Carver, was found with stolen property in her possession. Gold coins, family heirlooms, items taken from the homes of trusted citizens over the past 2 months. The crowd erupted in angry shouts. That's not true. Helen's voice broke as she struggled against the iron grip on her arms. I never took anything. Someone put those things in my room. Please, you have to listen. Lear! A woman's shrill voice cut through the crowd. Mrs. Beatrice Holbrook stepped forward, her face red with rage beneath her bonnet. She was the banker's wife, a woman who wore her status like armor. My grandmother's brooch was in that bag. The one with the emeralds. I'd know it anywhere. That brooch has been in my family for 3 generations. And my husband's gold watch, another woman added, tears streaming down her face. She was younger, barely older than Helen. Her name was Carolyn Meyer, and Helen had helped her carry groceries just last week. The one his father gave him before he died. It was the only thing we had left of him. Helen's chest tightened. She looked at the faces around her, searching desperately for someone, anyone, who might believe her. She saw Mrs. Patterson, who owned the boarding house where Helen sometimes helped with laundry. She saw Thomas Greer, the shopkeeper who always had a kind word. She saw Father Mulligan from the church, The man who had told her just Sunday that she was a blessing to the community, but she saw only hatred and certainty in their eyes. These people had already decided her guilt. The trial was over before it began. Mayor Ashford set the satchel down on a wooden crate and pulled out a small velvet pouch. He opened it slowly, deliberately, letting the crowd see the glint of gold and jewels inside. One by one, he held up the items. A brooch with green stones, a pocket watch with intricate engravings, a silver locket, a pair of pearl earrings. Each item brought fresh cries of recognition from the crowd. "The evidence speaks for itself," the mayor declared. "This woman has stolen from us. She has broken the sacred trust we extend to strangers in our community. She came here 6 months ago with nothing. We gave her work. We gave her shelter. And this is how she repays our Christian charity. I didn't do it." Helen screamed, her voice raw and desperate. "Please, you have to believe me. I work every day from dawn until midnight. I clean, I cook, I mend clothes. I never even leave the mercantile except to go to church on Sundays. When would I have time to steal from anyone? How would I even know where these people live?" "Quiet." The mayor's hand shot up, and the authority in his voice silenced her instantly. "Your lies only deepen your shame. Perhaps you thought we wouldn't notice. Perhaps you thought we were fools." Garrett Moss leaned close to her ear, his breath hot and sour against her face. "Should have kept your thieving hands to yourself, girl. Now you'll pay the price." Helen's knees buckled, but the men held her upright, their fingers digging into her arms hard enough to bruise. Her mind raced, trying to piece together how this had happened. Last night had been like any other. She had finished washing the dinner dishes for the Ashford family, scrubbed the floors in the mercantile, folded the linens, and banked the fire. She had returned to her small room behind the building, exhausted down to her bones. She'd barely managed to unlace her boots before collapsing onto her thin mattress. Sleep had taken her instantly. She hadn't heard anyone enter. She hadn't seen anything, but someone had been there. Someone had planted those items in her bag while she slept. "In the old days," Mayor Ashford continued, pacing before the crowd like a preacher at a revival, "we would have hanged a thief. Swift justice for a swift crime." He paused, letting the words hang in the cold air. Several men in the crowd nodded approvingly. "But we are civilized people now. We follow the law. We are not savages." A murmur of disappointment rippled through some of the more bloodthirsty onlookers. However, the mayor raised a finger, and his eyes glittered in the lantern light. "The law also allows for certain punishments that ensure a criminal is marked, branded, so that wherever they go, whatever new town they try to deceive, people will know what they are. They will see the mark and know to guard their valuables, to lock their doors, to protect their families from a proven thief." Helen's stomach dropped. Her mouth went dry. She had heard stories of brandings. Old stories from frontier justice, from mining camps and cattle towns, where law was whatever the strongest man said it was. But this was 1883. This was a proper town with a church and a schoolhouse and a telegraph office. "Bring the iron," the mayor commanded. The crowd parted like the Red Sea, from the direction of the blacksmith's forge. Garrett Moss's young apprentice emerged. A boy no more than 15 with soot-stained hands. He carried a long metal rod as if it were a sacred relic. The end glowed orange-red in the dim morning light, heat radiating from it in visible waves. Branded into the metal tip were letters that had been carefully shaped, heated, and prepared, "Criminal." Helen's scream tore through the square. No, please. I didn't do anything. I swear before God, I'm innocent. Please, someone, anyone, help me." But no one moved. No one spoke in her defense. Father Mulligan looked away. Mrs. Patterson covered her mouth with her hand. Thomas Greer stared at the ground. Not one person stepped forward. They dragged her to a wooden post in the center of the square, the same post where announcements were nailed and horses were sometimes tied. They forced her to her knees in the dirt. The cold mud soaked through her nightdress immediately, chilling her legs. Vernon Pike grabbed the collar of her nightdress and ripped it downward, tearing the fabric and exposing her right shoulder blade. The cold morning air bit into her bare skin. She thrashed wildly, kicked, clawed at the dirt, but more hands pressed down on her. Someone held her head. Someone pinned her arms. Someone pressed their knee into her back. "Hold her steady," the mayor commanded, his voice devoid of emotion. "We can't have the brand crooked. It needs to be clear, readable." Helen squeezed her eyes shut, tears streaming down her face and mixing with the dirt on her cheeks. She could feel the heat of the iron approaching, could hear the crackling hiss of it cutting through the air. The smell of burning metal filled her nostrils, acrid and sharp. Her breath came in short, panicked gasps. Her entire body trembled. "Please," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Please, I'm innocent. I didn't steal anything. Please don't do this." No one answered. The apprentice boy hesitated. His hand shook as he held the brand. For a moment, just a moment, Helen thought he might refuse. But Garrett Moss stepped forward and took the iron from the boy's hands. The blacksmith's face was hard as stone. "Someone has to do it," Moss said. "Might as well be me." The iron descended. The pain was unlike anything Helen had ever known. It wasn't just heat. It wasn't just burning. It was fire erupting from the inside out, consuming every nerve, every thought, every breath. The agony shot through her shoulder, down her spine, up into her skull. Her scream ripped from her throat so violently that something inside her seemed to tear. The world went white, then black, then red. She couldn't see. She couldn't hear. She existed only as pain, pure and absolute. And then it was over. They released her. She collapsed forward onto the dirt, her body convulsing uncontrollably. Her shoulder was a molten agony that pulsed with every heartbeat, sending fresh waves of torment through her with each breath. She couldn't speak. She couldn't even cry anymore. She could only lie there gasping, as the smell of her own burned flesh filled her lungs and made her stomach heave. Mayor Ashford stood over her, his polished boots inches from her face. "Let this be a lesson," he announced to the crowd. "Let this mark remind you, Helen Carver, and everyone who sees you, of what you are. A criminal, a thief, unworthy of trust, unworthy of mercy, unworthy of the kindness this community extended to you." He turned to address the assembled townspeople, spreading his arms wide like a prophet. "Let this also be a warning to any others who might consider taking what does not belong to them. We will find you. We will mark you. And we will cast you out." The crowd murmured approval. Some even applauded. "Remove her from this town," the mayor ordered, gesturing dismissively. "Take her beyond our borders. If she returns, if she is seen within 5 miles of Ashford Crossing, she will be shot on sight. Do I make myself clear?" "Yes, sir," Vernon Pike replied. Hands grabbed Helen again, but this time she didn't fight. She couldn't. Her body was broken, her spirit shattered, her mind barely clinging to consciousness. They dragged her through the dirt like a slaughtered animal, past the homes and shops she had cleaned and cared for, past the people she had smiled at and served, past the church where she had prayed every Sunday, past the mercantile where she had worked her fingers raw, past the schoolhouse where she had once dreamed of maybe, someday, teaching children to read. Not one person looked away. They wanted to see her suffer. They wanted to remember this moment at the edge of town, where the road dissolved into dense forest, and the last building gave way to wilderness. They threw her down like refuse. Her body hit the ground hard, knocking what little breath she had left from her lungs. She lay there, her cheek pressed against cold stones, her shoulder screaming, her nightdress torn and filthy. "Get out," Vernon Pike spat, his voice thick with disgust. "And don't come back. You're lucky we didn't hang you." Garrett Moss stood behind him, wiping his hands on his apron as if touching her had soiled him. "Be grateful the mayor's a merciful man," he added. "In the old days you'd be swinging from a tree right now." They turned and walked back toward town without another word. Helen lay in the dirt, unable to move, unable to think. She heard their footsteps retreat. She heard the town bell ring, signaling the start of a normal day. Roosters crowed. A dog barked somewhere. Life in Ashford Crossing continued as if nothing had happened, as if a woman hadn't just been tortured and exiled. And then she heard nothing but the wind moving through the trees, cold and indifferent. She didn't know how long she lay there. Minutes, hours. The sun climbed higher in the sky, and pale morning light filtered through the trees. The cold began to seep deeper into her bones, making her shiver violently. Her shoulder had gone from burning agony to a deep, throbbing numbness that frightened her even more. She knew that wasn't a good sign. Slowly, painfully, she pushed herself up onto her hands and knees. Her arms shook. Her vision swam. She vomited into the dirt, her body heaving even though there was nothing in her stomach. She hadn't eaten since yesterday afternoon. She forced herself to stand, swaying on her feet like a drunk. The forest stretched before her, dark and endless and utterly foreign. She had no food, no water, no shoes. Just a torn nightdress and a brand that would mark her for the rest of her life. However long that might be, Helen took one step forward. Then another. And another. Each movement sent fresh agony through her shoulder, but she kept walking. She didn't know where she was going. She only knew she had to move. Had to keep going. Because if she stopped, if she lay down again, she would never get back up. She didn't look back. Behind her, Ashford Crossing continued its day as if nothing had happened. Shops opened. Children were sent to school. The mayor went to his office. The stolen items were returned to their rightful owners. And in the comfort of their warm homes, the good people of Ashford Crossing told themselves they had done the right thing. But high on a ridge overlooking the town, hidden among the dense pines and rocky outcroppings, a figure watched. Puhibi Wolfhart stood motionless as a statue, his dark eyes fixed on the broken woman stumbling into the wilderness below. He had been tracking a mule deer since before dawn when the commotion in town had caught his attention. He had crept closer, curious about the noise, and had seen the entire spectacle from his vantage point. The dragging, the accusations, the branding, the cruelty. He had seen many things in his 32 years. He had seen his own people driven from their lands, had watched soldiers burn villages and slaughter women and children. He had seen white men lie and cheat and kill without consequence. But something about this particular injustice stirred something in him, something old and stubborn. He tilted his head slightly, studying her. Most people cast out like that didn't survive 3 days in this wilderness. The cold would take them first, or hunger, or the mountain lions that prowled these forests, or simple despair. But something about the way she walked, despite the pain, despite the horror, despite having every reason to simply lie down and die, told him she might be different. She had fight in her. He could see it in the set of her shoulders, in the way she refused to look back even once. Puhibi adjusted the bow on his shoulder and the quiver of arrows strapped to his back. He wore buckskin leggings and a heavy buffalo hide coat against the cold. His long black hair was tied back with a strip of leather. Around his neck hung a medicine pouch his grandmother had given him before she died, filled with herbs and stones that connected him to his ancestors. He began to move silently through the trees, keeping his distance but following her path. He didn't know why yet. Perhaps curiosity. Perhaps the memory of his own sister, who had been cast out by soldiers and left to die in the snow 20 winters ago. Perhaps something else, something he couldn't name, But instinct told him this woman's story was not yet finished. And Puhibi Volfhard always trusted his instincts. Below, Helen continued walking, each step a battle, each breath a prayer. She didn't know she was being watched. She didn't know that someone had seen what happened. She knew only pain and cold and the desperate need to survive one more hour. One more minute, one more step, the forest swallowed her whole. And the town of Ashford Crossing disappeared behind the trees. Helen didn't remember collapsing. One moment she was walking, forcing her legs to move despite the fire in her shoulder and the numbness spreading through her limbs. The next she was on the ground, her face pressed against a bed of pine needles that smelled of earth and decay. The sky above had turned from pale morning blue to a harsh white that hurt her eyes. She tried to push herself up, but her arms had no strength left. Her body had finally given out. The cold had seeped so deep into her bones that she couldn't feel her feet anymore. Her nightdress, torn and filthy, offered no protection against the autumn chill that was quickly turning toward winter. "This is how I die," she thought distantly. Alone in the woods like a hunted animal, her eyes drifted closed. The pain in her shoulder had evolved into something different now, a deep throbbing that pulsed in rhythm with her heartbeat. She could smell the burned flesh, could feel the raised edges of the brand even through the fog of exhaustion. The word criminal was now part of her, carved into her skin for anyone to see. She thought of her mother, dead these past 3 years. Thought of the small farmhouse where she'd grown up, the garden her mother had tended, the sound of hymns sung while kneading bread. Her mother had always said that God watched over the innocent, that truth would always prevail. Helen wanted to believe that. But lying here in the frozen dirt, branded and exiled for crimes she didn't commit, it was hard to have faith in anything. A shadow fell across her face. She forced her eyes open, expecting to see a wolf or a bear come to finish what the town had started. Instead, she saw a man standing over her, his form silhouetted against the white sky. For a confused moment, she thought perhaps the mayor had sent someone to ensure she was truly gone. But as her vision cleared, she realized this was no one from Ashford Crossing. The man was tall and broad-shouldered, dressed in buckskin and furs. His skin was bronze, his long black hair tied back from a face that was all sharp angles and watchful eyes. A Comanche, she realized with a jolt of fear. She had heard stories about the Comanche from other settlers, tales of raids and violence. Though she had never actually seen one up close, he crouched beside her, studying her face with an intensity that made her want to look away. But she couldn't move, could barely breathe. "You are dying," he said in English, his voice low and matter-of-fact. Not a question, an observation. Helen's lips moved, but no sound came out. Her throat was too dry, too raw from screaming. The man, Puhibi Volfhard, though she didn't know his name yet, tilted his head slightly. He had watched this woman walk for nearly 2 hours, had seen her stumble and fall and rise again 3 times before this final collapse. He had also seen what they had done to her in the town square, had witnessed the cruelty of civilized people. He reached out slowly, as one might approach a wounded deer, and pulled aside the torn fabric of her nightdress to examine her shoulder. The brand was worse than he'd expected. The flesh was burned deep, the letters clear and deliberate. Already, the edges were beginning to blister and weep. Without treatment, infection would set in within a day, maybe 2. And infection in a wound like this, in this cold, with no shelter or food, meant certain death. Puhibi had a choice to make. He could leave her here. It was not his problem. White people had done this to her. Let white people deal with the consequences. He owed nothing to these settlers who had taken his people's land, who had driven the buffalo to near extinction, who had broken every treaty they'd ever made. But something stopped him from walking away. Perhaps it was the memory of his sister, Yellow Bird, who had been found frozen in the snow after soldiers had driven her from the fort where she'd been seeking food. Perhaps it was the injustice of it, the wrongness that sat heavy in his gut. Or perhaps it was simply that he had always been unable to watch suffering without acting. Even when wisdom dictated otherwise, he made his decision. Puhibi slid his arms beneath Helen's body, lifting her as easily as if she weighed nothing. She made a small sound of pain but didn't wake fully. Her head lolled against his chest. He could feel how cold she was, how her body trembled even in unconsciousness. He carried her deeper into the forest, moving with the silent grace of someone who had spent his entire life in these woods. He knew every game trail, every stream, every shelter. And he knew of a place where she might survive. 20 minutes later, he arrived at a small cave tucked into the side of a rocky outcropping. It wasn't much, just a shallow depression in the stone barely large enough for 2 people, but it was dry and protected from the wind. He had used it before when hunting in this area. Inside, he kept a few supplies, a blanket made from rabbit pelts, some dried meat wrapped in oilcloth, a clay pot for water. He laid Helen down on the cave floor and immediately went to work. First, he needed fire. He gathered dry kindling from the back of the cave where he'd stored it, along with larger pieces of deadwood. Within minutes, he had flames crackling in a ring of stones near the cave entrance, positioned so the smoke would drift out rather than fill the small space. Next, he examined her shoulder again. The brand needed to be cleaned and treated, or she would die of fever before the week was out. He retrieved his medicine pouch and pulled out several items. Dried yarrow for stopping infection, ground willow bark for pain, and a small tin of bear grease mixed with healing herbs. He heated water in the clay pot until it was warm, then soaked a piece of soft leather in it. Gently, carefully, he began to clean the burned flesh. Helen's eyes flew open with a gasp of agony. She tried to pull away, but Puhibi held her steady with one hand while continuing to work with the other. "Be still," he said quietly. "I am helping you." Helen's vision swam. She saw the fire, the cave walls, the man's dark eyes focused on her wound. Her mind struggled to make sense of where she was, what was happening. The last thing she clearly remembered was walking, falling, giving up. "Who are you?" She managed to whisper, "Puhibi," he replied, not looking up from his work. "Volfhart, in your language, why?" The word came out broken. "Why are you doing this?" He paused, meeting her eyes briefly. "Because you were dying. And I do not wish to see you die." It was the simplest answer, and perhaps the most honest one he could have given. He returned his attention to her shoulder, applying the yarrow paste to the burned flesh. She hissed in pain but didn't pull away again. "They said I was a thief," Helen said suddenly, her voice thick with emotion. "They said I stole from them. But I didn't. I swear I didn't." Puhibi wrapped her shoulder with clean strips of cloth he'd torn from an old shirt. "I know," he said simply. She blinked, confused. "How could you possibly know?" "Because I watched," he replied. "I saw what they did to you. I saw your face. The face of a thief does not look like yours did. A thief knows what they have done. You did not know. You were confused, afraid. That is not the face of guilt." Tears spilled down Helen's cheeks. It was the first time anyone had said they believed her, the first acknowledgement that she might be telling the truth. The relief of it was almost as overwhelming as the pain. "They put things in my room," she said, the words tumbling out now. "While I was sleeping. I never saw who. I never heard them. But someone did it. Someone wanted me to take the blame." Puhibi nodded slowly. He had suspected as much. He finished wrapping her shoulder and sat back on his heels. "You should rest now. Your body needs time to heal." "I can't stay here," Helen protested weakly. "You've already done too much." "I can't ask you to." "You did not ask," Puhibi interrupted. "I chose. Now rest." He moved to the cave entrance and sat with his back against the stone, his bow across his lap. Outside, the day was growing darker. Snow had begun to fall, light flakes drifting down through the trees. Winter was coming early this year, behind him. Helen's breathing gradually evened out as exhaustion and the willow bark's effects pulled her into sleep. Puhibi stared out at the falling snow and thought about the town below. Someone in that town had destroyed this woman's life. Someone had stolen those items and hidden them in her belongings, knowing exactly what would happen when they were found. Someone had condemned her to torture and death. And whoever that person was, they were still free, still safe. Still living among those righteous townspeople who thought they had dispensed justice. Puhibi had spent most of his adult life avoiding white settlements. After what had happened to his people, after watching the broken treaties and broken promises.
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you.
He had chosen to live alone in these mountains, hunting and trapping, visiting the reservation only when necessary to trade for supplies or see his remaining family. But something about this situation bothered him deeply. An innocent woman had been punished while the guilty one walked free. It was a kind of injustice that demanded correction. He made another decision. When Helen was strong enough, when she had recovered enough to travel, he would help her find the truth. He would help her discover who had done this to her. Not because he cared about white man's justice, but because he cared about actual justice. The real kind. The kind that didn't depend on who had power or money or the right family name. 3 days passed. Helen drifted in and out of consciousness, her body fighting fever and exhaustion. Puhibi tended her shoulder twice daily, changing the dressings and applying fresh medicine. He brought her water, coaxed her to eat small amounts of dried meat and berries, and kept the fire burning constantly. On the 4th day, she woke fully for the first time. The fever had broken during the night, and though she was still weak, her eyes were clear. She found herself alone in the cave, wrapped in the rabbit pelt blanket. The fire crackled softly. Outside, she could hear birds calling. She sat up slowly, testing her body. Everything hurt, but it was a manageable pain now, not the overwhelming agony of before. Her shoulder was still tender, but the throbbing had lessened. She could move her arm, though it sent sharp twinges through the burned area. Puhibi appeared at the cave entrance, carrying a dead rabbit. He paused when he saw her sitting up. "You are better," he observed. "Thanks to you," Helen replied. She watched as he began preparing the rabbit for cooking, his movements efficient and practiced. "How long have I been here?" "For days, 4 days. 4 days since the branding. 4 days since her entire life had been destroyed. It felt like both a lifetime and no time at all. I need to leave," she said quietly. "I need to get far away from here. Maybe go east, find a city where no one knows me." Puhibi was silent for a long moment, focusing on skinning the rabbit. Finally, he spoke. "Running will not change what they did to you. The mark will still be there. And whoever put those items in your room will still be free." Helen pulled the blanket tighter around herself. "What else can I do? Go back?" "They'll shoot me on sight." "The mayor made that very clear. Not go back," Puhibi said. He speared the rabbit meat on a stick and positioned it over the fire. "But find the truth. Discover who did this. Prove you were right and they were wrong," she laughed bitterly. "And how exactly would I do that? I have no proof. No allies. Nothing but this brand marking me as a criminal. Even if I could prove who really stole those things, who would believe me?" Puhibi looked at her directly, his dark eyes intense. "I would believe you. And I would help you." Helen stared at him, trying to understand why this stranger would offer such a thing. "Why would you help me? You don't know me. You don't owe me anything." "Because it is the right thing to do," he replied simply. "And because I know what it is to be blamed for things you did not do. My people have been called savages, thieves, murderers. We have been punished for defending our own land. So yes, I know what it is to be marked as something you are not. The rabbit was beginning to cook, filling the cave with the smell of roasting meat. Helen's stomach growled, despite everything. I wouldn't even know where to start. She admitted. Start by thinking, Puhibi said. Who had reason to want you blamed? Who could enter your room without being seen? Who knew where those stolen items were? Helen closed her eyes, forcing herself to think past the trauma and pain. She had worked at the Ashford Mercantile for 6 months, living in the small servants' quarters behind the building. The family consisted of Mayor Cornelius Ashford, his wife Margaret, and their adult son, Daniel. Daniel was in his late 20s, recently returned from back east where he'd been studying law. She had rarely interacted with the mayor or his wife, but Daniel had been around more often. He'd been friendly, perhaps too friendly. She had caught him watching her sometimes, had noticed how he found excuses to come into the kitchen when she was working. But Daniel was the mayor's son. He had money, position, respect. Why would he steal from his own neighbors? Unless it wasn't about the stealing at all. A memory surfaced, sharp and sudden. 2 weeks ago, Daniel had cornered her in the storeroom. He'd stood too close, had touched her arm in a way that made her uncomfortable. He'd suggested she might want to be friendlier with him, that life could be much easier for her if she was. She had politely but firmly declined and left the room as quickly as possible. The next day, he'd been cold to her. Angry, even. She'd thought nothing of it at the time, had simply been relieved he'd left her alone. There was someone, she said slowly, opening her eyes. The mayor's son, Daniel Ashford. He made advances toward me. I rejected him. Shortly after that, the thefts started. Puhibi nodded thoughtfully. Men with power do not like to be refused, especially by those they consider beneath them. But I can't prove he did it, Helen said. It's just suspicion. And even if he did steal those things and plant them in my room, how would we ever prove it? By watching, Puhibi replied. By learning his patterns. By finding evidence. And perhaps by setting a trap. Helen looked at this strange man who had saved her life, who was now offering to risk his own safety to help her. She didn't understand him, but she was beginning to trust him. It's dangerous, she said. For both of us. Especially for you. If they catch you helping me, I have faced danger before, Puhibi said with the hint of a smile. I am still here. Outside the cave, the snow had stopped. The forest was quiet, except for the wind moving through the pines. Helen looked down at her hands, at the dirt under her fingernails, at the borrowed blanket covering her ruined nightdress. She thought about running, about disappearing into some distant city where she could try to start over. But Puhibi was right. Running wouldn't change anything. The brand would still be there. The injustice would still stand. And whoever had done this to her would be free to do it again to someone else. She had been raised to turn the other cheek, to forgive those who trespassed against her. But this wasn't about vengeance. This was about truth. About justice. About refusing to let someone destroy her and get away with it. All right, she said finally, lifting her eyes to meet his. I'll do it. I'll help you find the proof. But I don't even know where to begin. Puhibi turned the rabbit meat, checking its progress. We begin by getting you strong again. You cannot hunt truth if you can barely walk. So first, you heal. You eat. You regain your strength. And while you do, I will watch the town. I will learn who Daniel Ashford is, where he goes, what he does. You'll go into town? Helen asked, alarmed. They'll see you. They will not see me, Puhibi replied with quiet confidence. I have been watching your people for many years. They do not look up. They do not notice the shadows. They see only what they expect to see. He pulled the rabbit from the fire and divided it between them. The meat was hot and tender, and Helen ate ravenously despite her earlier claims of having no appetite. She hadn't realized how hungry she was until the food was in front of her, As they ate in companionable silence, Helen found herself studying her unlikely savior, Puhibi Wolfheart, a Comanche hunter who had no reason to help her, but had chosen to anyway, who spoke of watching the town and setting traps as calmly as another man might discuss the weather. "Why do you live alone?" she asked suddenly. He was quiet for a long moment. "Because my people are mostly gone from these lands. Those who remain are on the reservation, living on government rations, forbidden to hunt or travel freely. I tried living there for a time, but I could not breathe in that place. So I left. I hunt, I trap, I trade, and I stay free in the only way left to me. Don't you get lonely?" "Sometimes," he admitted. "But loneliness is better than captivity." Helen understood that better now than she ever had before. She had been captured in her own way, trapped by false accusations and the cruelty of people she'd thought were civilized. Puhibi had chosen his solitude. Hers had been forced upon her. "When I'm strong enough," she said, "teach me to survive out here. To hunt, to track, to move without being seen. If we're going to do this, I need to be more than just a burden." Puhibi regarded her with something that might have been respect. "You are not a burden. But yes, I will teach you. Starting tomorrow." That night, Helen lay wrapped in the rabbit pelt blanket, staring at the cave ceiling while Puhibi kept watch at the entrance. The fire cast dancing shadows on the stone. Her shoulder ached, but it was a healing ache now, not the agonizing burn of before. For the first time since that horrible morning in Ashford Crossing, she felt something other than despair. She felt purpose, determination, and perhaps, just perhaps, the faint stirring of hope. She didn't know if they could succeed. Didn't know if they could prove her innocence or expose Daniel Ashford. But she knew she had to try, because the alternative was spending the rest of her life running, hiding, letting the word branded into her flesh define who she was. And Helen Carver refused to let that happen. Helen woke before dawn to find Puhibi already gone. The cave was cold. The fire reduced to glowing embers that gave off barely any warmth. She sat up carefully, testing her shoulder. The pain was still there, a constant reminder of what had been done to her, but it was manageable now. She could move without gasping, could think past the agony. She added wood to the fire and coaxed the flames back to life, using the techniques Puhibi had shown her the day before. It took longer than when he did it, but eventually the fire crackled strong again. She felt an absurd pride at this small accomplishment. Outside, the forest was still dark, though the sky had begun to lighten at the edges. Frost covered everything, making the world look like it had been dipped in silver. Helen wrapped the rabbit pelt around her shoulders and stepped out of the cave. Breathing in the sharp, cold air, she heard him before she saw him, the soft crunch of boots on frozen ground. Puhibi emerged from the trees, carrying something draped over his shoulder. As he got closer, she realized it was clothing. "You cannot learn to move in the forest wearing that," he said, nodding at her torn nightdress. He handed her the bundle. "These belong to my sister. She was taller than you, but they will fit better than what you have." Helen unfolded the items carefully. Buckskin leggings, a long shirt made of soft deerskin, and a thick wool coat that had probably been traded from settlers years ago. The clothes were worn but well made, and they smelled faintly of sage smoke. "Your sister," Helen said quietly. "What happened to her?" Puhibi's jaw tightened. "She died in the winter. 12 years ago. The soldiers came to our camp and accused her of stealing a horse. She had not. But they did not care about truth. They drove her into the snow without food or shelter. We found her 3 days later." Helen's chest constricted. "I'm so sorry. It is why I understand," Puhibi said simply. "Now change. We have much to do today." She retreated into the cave and changed quickly, her fingers clumsy with cold and nervousness. The buckskin felt strange against her skin, so different from the cotton and linen she was used to. but it was warm and allowed her to move freely. When she emerged, Puhibi nodded approvingly. Better. Now you will not catch on every branch and thorn. Come. He led her deeper into the forest, moving at a pace that made her breath come hard as she struggled to keep up. Her body was still weak from days of fever, but she refused to complain or ask him to slow down. If she was going to survive out here, if she was going to help find the truth, she needed to be strong. They walked for nearly an hour before Puhibi finally stopped in a small clearing. The sun had risen fully now, though it provided little warmth. He turned to face her, his expression serious. You must learn 3 things, he said. How to move without sound, how to see without being seen, and how to survive without help. Today we start with the first. For the next several hours, Puhibi taught her the art of silent movement, how to place her feet to avoid snapping twigs, how to distribute her weight to minimize sound, how to use the natural cover of trees and rocks to mask her presence. It was harder than it looked, requiring constant attention and a kind of awareness she had never developed. You walk like a cow, Puhibi observed after her 5th attempt at crossing the clearing silently. Heavy, thoughtless. Every animal in the forest knows you are here. Helen wanted to snap at him, to say that she was trying her best, that she had been branded and left for dead less than a week ago. But she bit back the words. He was right. She was clumsy and loud, and if they were going to spy on Daniel Ashford, she needed to be better. Show me again, she said through gritted teeth. Puhibi demonstrated once more, his movements so fluid and quiet that she could barely hear him even though she was watching intently. He made it look effortless. She tried again. And again. And again. By midday, she was exhausted and frustrated, her shoulder aching from the exertion. But she was also improving. The last time she crossed the clearing, she only made noise twice. Better, Puhibi acknowledged. You learn quickly when you stop trying so hard. They rested by a small stream, and Puhibi produced strips of dried venison from his pack. Helen ate gratefully, dipping her hands in the icy water to wash her face. Tell me about the town, Puhibi said as they ate. The layout. Who lives where? Where Daniel Ashford goes during the day. Helen closed her eyes, picturing Ashford Crossing in her mind. The town is built along a main street. The mercantile where I worked is at the north end, closest to the forest. The mayor's house is attached to it, a large 2-story building with white columns. Daniel has rooms on the 2nd floor, facing east. What else? The church is in the center of town with the schoolhouse next to it. The saloon and boarding house are at the south end. There's a blacksmith's forge on the west side and a small bank next to the general store. Most of the families live in houses scattered around the main street. Puhibi nodded, absorbing this information. And Daniel Ashford? What does he do with his days? Helen thought carefully. He's supposed to be helping his father with town business, but mostly he drinks at the saloon and plays cards. He has friends. Vernon Pike, who owns the saloon. Garrett Moss, the blacksmith. And Marcus Webb, whose father owns the bank. These friends. Are they loyal to him? I think so. Or maybe they're just afraid of crossing the mayor's son. Helen paused, remembering something. There was one time I saw Daniel arguing with Marcus. It was late at night, maybe 2 months ago. I was taking out the evening trash, and they were in the alley behind the mercantile. Daniel was angry, saying something about money owed. Marcus looked scared. Puhibi's eyes sharpened. Money owed. That is interesting. You think Daniel has debts? Rich men often have the largest debts, Puhibi replied. They believe credit is endless. And desperate men do desperate things. Helen felt a spark of understanding. If Daniel owed money and couldn't pay, he might have stolen those items to sell them. And when he needed to hide the evidence, he used me as the scapegoat, perhaps, Puhibi said. But we need proof, not guesses. Tonight, I will go into town. I will watch Daniel's movements, see who he meets with, where he goes. I'm coming with you. Helen said immediately. No. Yes, she insisted. I know the town. I know the people. I can help. Puhibi studied her for a long moment. You are not ready. You are still healing. And if someone sees you, if they recognize you, they will shoot you. The mayor made that very clear. Then I'll make sure no one recognizes me, Helen said stubbornly. I'll stay hidden. I'll do exactly as you say. But I need to do this. I need to see for myself. Something in her tone must have convinced him, because Puhibi finally nodded. Very well. But if I tell you to run, you run. If I tell you to hide, you hide. No questions. No hesitation. Agreed? Agreed. They spent the rest of the afternoon preparing. Puhibi showed her how to darken her skin with mud and ashes to blend into shadows. He braided her auburn hair tightly and had her tuck it under a dark cap he'd fashioned from an old shirt. When he was finished, she looked at her reflection in the stream and barely recognized herself. Good, Puhibi said. Your own mother would not know you in the dark. As evening approached, they made their way toward Ashford Crossing. Helen's heart pounded harder with each step. Part of her was terrified of going back, of being so close to the people who had tortured and exiled her. But another part, a part that had been growing stronger each day, wanted to face them. Wanted to prove they had been wrong. They reached the edge of the forest just as full darkness fell. The town was lit by lanterns and firelight, looking almost peaceful from a distance. Helen could see people moving between buildings, could hear the faint sound of piano music drifting from the saloon. Puhibi touched her arm, and she froze. He pointed to a position behind a large oak tree that had a clear view of the main street. They moved to it silently, settling into the shadows. Now we wait, Puhibi whispered. And we watch. They didn't have to wait long. Within 20 minutes, Daniel Ashford emerged from the mayor's house. Even from a distance, Helen could see the arrogance in his walk, the way he carried himself as if the entire town belonged to him. He was dressed in an expensive suit with a gold watch chain glinting across his vest. He walked directly to the saloon and disappeared inside. He goes there every night, Helen whispered. Usually stays until past midnight, Puhibi nodded. We should look at his rooms while he is gone. Helen's eyes widened. Break into the mayor's house? You want proof, Puhibi said simply. Proof must be found. They circled around to the back of the mercantile, staying in the deep shadows between buildings. Helen's former quarters were dark and empty. Seeing them made her chest tight with anger and loss. This had been her home, small as it was. And they had ripped it away from her. Puhibi examined the back door of the main house. It was locked, but he produced a thin piece of metal from his pocket and worked it into the lock mechanism. Within seconds, the door clicked open. How did you learn to do that? Helen whispered, I watch. I learn, Puhibi replied. Now move quickly and stay quiet. They slipped inside. The house was silent, the mayor and his wife apparently already in bed. Helen led the way up the back stairs, the route she had taken countless times when delivering meals or linens to the family. Her heart hammered so loudly she was certain someone would hear it. Daniel's door was unlocked. They entered his room and closed the door behind them, and Puhibi lit a small candle he'd brought, shielding it with his hand to minimize the light. The room was a mess. Clothes thrown over chairs, empty whiskey bottles on the desk, papers scattered everywhere. The bed was unmade, and the whole space reeked of cigar smoke and unwashed linens. What are we looking for? Helen whispered. Anything that connects into the thefts. Receipts, letters, hidden items. Puhibi moved to the desk and began carefully searching through the papers. Helen checked the wardrobe, running her hands along the inside panels, checking for hidden compartments. She found expensive suits, more clothes than one person could possibly need, but nothing incriminating. She was about to give up when her fingers brushed against something that felt different. A seam that didn't quite match. She pressed on it, and a small panel in the back of the wardrobe popped open. Inside was a leather journal. Helen pulled it out with trembling hands and brought it to the candlelight. The journal was filled with entries in Daniel's handwriting. She flipped through the pages, her eyes widening as she read. "Puhibi," she breathed. "Look at this." The journal was a ledger of sorts, documenting gambling debts. Page after page of losses, money owed to various people in Ashford Crossing and neighboring towns. The amounts were staggering. Daniel Ashford owed nearly $3,000. "$3,000, Helen whispered. "That's more than most families make in 5 years. Puhibi leaned over her shoulder, studying the entries. "And here," he pointed to a note scrawled in the margin. "He writes about selling items to pay debts. Look at the dates." Helen's blood ran cold. The dates matched the thefts. Each stolen item corresponded with a payment notation in the ledger. Mrs. Holbrook's emerald brooch had been taken on September 15th, that same day. Daniel had noted a payment to someone named Collins for $200. The pocket watch had been stolen on October 3rd, with a corresponding payment to Webb, Marcus Webb, Helen said suddenly. "Daniel's friend. The one whose father owns the bank. He must have been loaning Daniel money or collecting gambling debts," Puhibi added. "Either way, this journal proves Daniel took those items, but it doesn't prove he planted them in my room," Helen said, her brief excitement fading. "It shows he's a thief, but not that he framed me." Puhibi continued searching the desk. He pulled open drawers, checked under papers, examined everything methodically. Then he found it, a letter tucked into a book on the bottom shelf. The letter was from Marcus Webb, dated 2 days before Helen had been accused. It read, "Daniel, your father is growing suspicious about your debts. You need to create a distraction, something that will occupy his attention and give us time to settle accounts without his interference. The servant girl is an easy target. No family, no connections. Who would believe her over you?" Helen's hands shook as she held the letter. Here it was, proof, written evidence that Daniel and Marcus had conspired to frame her, to destroy her life simply to create a distraction. "We need to take this," she said. "No," Puhibi replied firmly. "If we take it, he will know someone was here. He will hide the rest of the evidence. We need to leave everything exactly as it was, but this proves my innocence." "It proves their guilt," Puhibi corrected. "But if we take it now, they will simply deny it, say it was forged. We need more. We need them to confess in front of witnesses." Helen wanted to argue, but she knew he was right. She carefully placed the letter back exactly where Puhibi had found it, committing every word to memory. They returned everything to its original position and slipped out of the room as silently as they had entered. Back down the stairs, through the kitchen, out the door. Within minutes, they were back in the forest shadows. Helen's entire body was shaking, but not from fear. From rage, from vindication. They had been right. Daniel and Marcus had deliberately framed her, had watched her be tortured and exiled, all to create a distraction from Daniel's gambling debts. "We need to expose them," she said as they walked back toward the cave. "We need to make them pay for what they did." "Yes," Puhibi agreed. "But carefully. These men have power. If we move too quickly, they will crush us like insects. We need a plan that forces them to reveal the truth themselves." "How?" Puhibi was quiet for a long moment, thinking. "We need to make them afraid. Fear makes people careless, makes them reveal things they should keep hidden. If we can make them believe their secret is about to be exposed, they will panic. And when they panic, they will make mistakes." Helen's mind raced. What if there were more thefts? What if items started disappearing again, but this time with me clearly gone? That would prove I wasn't the original thief. "No," Puhibi shook his head. "We are not thieves. We will not become what they accused you of being.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story.
There must be another way. They walked in silence for a while, both of them thinking. The forest was alive with night sounds, owls hooting, small animals rustling through underbrush. Helen found she wasn't afraid of these sounds anymore. They were becoming familiar, almost comforting. What if we made them think someone knew? Helen said suddenly, "What if we left a message, something that would make Daniel think his secret was about to be revealed?" Puhibi considered this. What kind of message? A note, anonymous, saying something like, "I know what you did." The truth will come out. If we leave it somewhere, Daniel will find it, but no one else will see. It might make him panic enough to contact Marcus. And if we can witness that meeting, hear what they say to each other, then we will have proof of conspiracy, Puhibi finished. And if we arrange for the right people to overhear that conversation, they'll condemn themselves, Helen said, feeling a surge of hope. It could work. It is dangerous, Puhibi warned. If they suspect we are behind it, if they discover you are still nearby, everything about this is dangerous, Helen replied. But I can't run away and let them win. I won't. Puhibi looked at her in the moonlight, seeing the determination in her face, the steel that had been forged through suffering. You have changed, he observed. The woman I found dying in the forest was broken. You are no longer broken. No, Helen agreed. I'm angry. And I'm ready to fight back. They reached the cave as the night grew deeper. Inside, Helen carefully wrote out the message on a piece of paper Puhibi had in his supplies. The words were simple but effective. I know about the journal. I know about the letter. The truth will be revealed soon. Repent while you still can, tomorrow night, Puhibi said. I will place this in Daniel's room while he is at the saloon. Then we wait and watch. When he finds it, he will go to Marcus. And we will be there to see what happens next. Helen nodded, folding the note carefully. For the first time since the branding, she felt like she had some control over her fate. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was hunting. And the prey didn't even know they were being tracked. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling through the pine trees. Winter was coming fast. But Helen no longer feared the cold. The note disappeared from Daniel Ashford's desk drawer within 3 hours of Puhibi placing it there. Helen and Puhibi watched from their concealed position in the hayloft of the livery stable across from the mayor's house. They had arrived before dawn, climbing silently into the dusty space that reeked of horses and old leather. Through gaps in the wooden slats, they had a clear view of Daniel's window. The sun had barely risen when Daniel stumbled home from an all-night card game. His gait unsteady, his expensive coat stained with whiskey. He disappeared into the house, and for 2 hours, nothing happened. Helen's legs cramped from staying motionless, but she didn't move. Puhibi sat beside her like a statue, his breathing so controlled she sometimes forgot he was there. Then Daniel's window flew open. Even from across the street, they could see the panic on his face. He leaned out, scanning the street below as if expecting to see someone watching. His hands gripped the windowsill so hard his knuckles went white. He found it, Helen whispered. Puhibi nodded slightly. Now we see what he does. Daniel vanished from the window. Moments later, he burst out the front door, still wearing the same rumpled clothes from the night before. He didn't head toward the saloon or the general store. Instead, he walked quickly toward the edge of town, constantly looking over his shoulder. He's going to Marcus Webb, Helen said. Then we follow, Puhibi replied. They climbed down from the loft and moved through the back alleys, keeping Daniel in sight, but staying far enough behind that he wouldn't notice them. The morning was cold and overcast, threatening snow. Most of Ashford Crossing was still asleep, which made trailing Daniel easier but also more dangerous. Any movement could be spotted on the empty streets. Daniel led them to a small house on the outskirts of town, a modest structure that seemed too plain for someone from the web banking family. He pounded on the door with his fist, not caring about the noise. The door opened, and Marcus Webb appeared, still in his nightshirt, his blonde hair disheveled. Even from their hiding spot behind a woodpile 50 yards away, Helen could see the irritation on his face. "What the hell are you doing here at this hour?" Marcus's voice carried in the still morning air, inside. Now, Daniel pushed past him into the house. The door slammed shut. Puhibi touched Helen's arm and gestured toward the side of the house. They moved silently across the frozen ground, pressing themselves against the wall beneath a window. Voices drifted out, muffled but audible. "You're drunk," Marcus was saying. "Go home and sleep it off. Someone knows." Daniel's voice was high-pitched with panic. "Someone left a note in my room. They mentioned the journal, the letter. They know everything." A pause. Then Marcus spoke, his tone much more serious now. "What note? What are you talking about?" "This note." The sound of paper rustling. "It was in my desk drawer. Someone broke into my room and left this." Helen and Puhibi exchanged glances. "This was better than they'd hoped." "Christ," Marcus muttered. "Who else has keys to your room?" "Just my parents, and they'd never sneak around like that." "Someone else was there. Someone who knows what we did." "Keep your voice down," Marcus hissed. "Think, Daniel. Who could possibly know? We were careful. The girl is gone, probably dead by now. No one else was involved. Maybe she told someone before they ran her off," Daniel suggested, his voice cracking. "Maybe she had a friend we didn't know about." "She had no friends," Marcus said coldly. "That's why we chose her. No family, no connections, no one to ask questions. That was the whole point." Helen's fists clenched so hard her nails bit into her palms. Hearing them discuss her like she was nothing, like she was just a convenient pawn in their scheme, made her want to burst through the door and scream the truth in their faces. But Puhibi's hand on her shoulder kept her still. "Then who?" Daniel demanded. "Who left this note?" "I don't know," Marcus admitted. "But panicking isn't going to help. Maybe it's a bluff. Maybe someone suspects something but doesn't actually have proof." They mentioned the journal specifically. "And the letter. Your letter. The one where you told me to frame her." "I never told you to frame anyone," Marcus said sharply. "I suggested creating a distraction. You're the one who decided to plant those stolen items in her room. Don't you dare try to pin this all on me," Daniel snarled. "You're the one who loaned me the money. You're the one who said your father was getting suspicious about the missing funds from the bank. You needed a distraction just as much as I did." Helen's eyes widened. Missing funds from the bank. This was bigger than just Daniel's gambling debts. "Keep your voice down," Marcus repeated, but there was fear in his tone now. "If my father finds out about the discrepancies in the accounts, he'll find out we both stole from the bank to cover my debts, and we'll both hang," Daniel finished. "So what do we do about this note?" Silence. Helen pressed closer to the wall, straining to hear. "We find out who sent it," Marcus said finally. "And we silence them. Permanently. Just like we should have done with the girl instead of just branding her." "You wanted to kill her?" Daniel sounded shocked. "I wanted to eliminate all loose ends," Marcus replied coldly. "But your father insisted on doing things the civilized way. Now look where we are. If she somehow survived out there and came back, she couldn't have survived," Daniel interrupted. "It's been over a week. No food, no shelter, branded like an animal. She's dead, Marcus." "She has to be. Then who sent the note?" Marcus demanded more silence. Helen could hear footsteps pacing inside the house. "What if we're looking at this wrong?" Daniel said slowly. "What if this is an opportunity?" "What do you mean?" "Someone out there knows our secret. But they haven't gone to the sheriff or my father yet. They sent an anonymous note instead. That means they want something. Blackmail, Marcus breathed. Exactly. So we wait. Whoever sent this will contact us again with their demands. And when they do, we'll be ready for them. Helen felt a chill run down her spine. They had anticipated the note might scare Daniel into making mistakes, but they hadn't considered he might see it as a blackmail attempt. What if they don't want money? Marcus asked. What if they just want to expose us? Then why not do it already? Daniel countered. No, they want something. And we'll give them whatever they ask for. But when they come to collect, we'll make sure they never tell anyone what they know. The implication was clear. They were planning murder. Puhibi tugged Helen's sleeve, signaling it was time to leave. They backed away from the window and retreated into the trees at the edge of town. Only when they were well hidden did they stop. They think someone is trying to blackmail them, Helen whispered urgently. They're going to try to kill whoever they think sent that note. Yes, Puhibi agreed, his expression grim. We have stirred up a hornet's nest. But we also learned much. Marcus Webb has been stealing from his father's bank to cover Daniel's gambling debts. That is a serious crime, far more serious than Daniel's personal thefts. But we still can't prove it, Helen said in frustration. It's still just our word against theirs, and we were hiding outside a window. No one will believe us. Perhaps not yet, Puhibi said thoughtfully. But now we know the full scope of their crimes. And we know they are frightened. Frightened men make mistakes. We must be patient. They made their way back toward the cave, taking a longer route to ensure no one saw them. Helen's mind raced with everything they'd overheard. Daniel and Marcus hadn't just framed her on a whim. They had deliberately chosen her because she was vulnerable, because she had no one to defend her. And Marcus had wanted her dead from the start. The casual cruelty of it all made her sick. Back at the cave, they sat by the fire, and Helen stared into the flames. What now? She asked. We can't send another note. They'll be watching for whoever delivers it. No more notes, Puhibi agreed. But there is someone else who should know what we learned. Someone with the power to investigate the bank. Who? The territorial marshal, Puhibi said. His office is in Denver, 2 days' ride from here. If we can get word to him about the missing bank funds, he will have the authority to examine the books. And if Marcus Webb has been stealing, the evidence will be there. Helen nodded slowly. But how do we contact the marshal without revealing that I'm still alive? The moment anyone in Ashford Crossing knows I'm nearby, they'll come after me. I will go, Puhibi said simply. I can reach Denver and back in 4 days. You will stay here, hidden, safe. Absolutely not, Helen protested. I'm not hiding in a cave while you risk yourself for me. You cannot come, Puhibi said firmly. The journey is hard, and you are still healing. And if something goes wrong, if someone recognizes you, all of this will be for nothing. Helen wanted to argue, but she knew he was right. Her shoulder was better, but she still tired easily. And the brand on her back would identify her instantly to anyone who saw it. 4 days, she said reluctantly. But you have to promise me you'll be careful. If anything happens to you because of me, nothing will happen, Puhibi assured her. I have been traveling these lands since before you were born. I know how to move unseen. He began preparing for the journey immediately, packing supplies, checking his weapons, and going over the details of what Helen should do while he was gone. She was to stay near the cave, keep the fire small during the day and larger at night for warmth. And under no circumstances was she to go near Ashford Crossing. There is enough dried meat and water for a week, he told her, showing her where he'd stored additional supplies. If I am not back in 7 days, go east. Follow the river downstream until you reach the settlement at 3 Forks. Tell them you need passage to Denver. Do not come looking for me, Puhibi. Promise me, he insisted, gripping her shoulders and looking directly into her eyes. If something goes wrong, you must save yourself. Do not waste the chance I am giving you." Helen swallowed hard. "I promise." He left before dawn the next morning, disappearing into the forest so quietly she barely heard him go. And just like that, Helen was alone. The first day passed slowly. She tended the fire, practiced the tracking skills Puhibi had taught her, and tried not to think about all the ways his journey could go wrong. What if someone in Denver recognized him as Comanche and refused to help? What if the marshal didn't believe his story? What if Daniel and Marcus somehow found out and ambushed him on the road? By the second day, Helen was restless and anxious. She knew she should stay at the cave as Puhibi had instructed, but sitting idle while so much was at stake felt impossible. She found herself walking the perimeter of her safe area, always staying within earshot of the cave, but exploring the surrounding forest. That's when she saw the smoke. It was mid-afternoon, and she had climbed to a rocky outcropping that gave her a view of the valley below. Ashford Crossing was visible in the distance, and rising from the center of town was a thick column of black smoke. Something was burning. Helen's first instinct was to run back to the cave and stay hidden as Puhibi had told her. But curiosity and concern warred with caution. What if the mercantile was burning? What if someone was hurt? Despite everything the town had done to her, she couldn't help but worry about innocent people caught in a fire. She made a decision she would later question. Wrapping herself in her darkest clothes and using the techniques Puhibi had taught her, Helen made her way closer to town, staying in the tree line and moving carefully. As she got nearer, she could hear shouting and see people running with buckets. The building that was burning wasn't the mercantile. It was the bank, Marcus Webb's father's bank. Helen's blood ran cold. This was no accident. She crept closer, using the chaos and smoke as cover, until she could see the scene more clearly. The entire front of the bank was engulfed in flames. People were forming bucket brigades, but it was clear the building was lost. Standing well back from the fire, watching with satisfaction barely concealed on his face, was Marcus Webb. Helen's mind raced. The missing funds from the bank. The ledgers that would prove Marcus had been stealing. They were inside that burning building, and Marcus was making sure they turned to ash. "He's destroying the evidence," she whispered to herself. But then she saw something that changed everything. Through the smoke and flames, through one of the bank's side windows, she glimpsed movement. Someone was still inside. The crowd hadn't noticed. They were focused on the front of the building, trying to keep the fire from spreading to neighboring structures. But Helen had the angle to see what they couldn't. Someone was trapped in that inferno. Every instinct screamed at her to stay hidden, to let events unfold without her involvement. Getting involved meant revealing herself, meant risking capture and execution. But Puhibi's words echoed in her mind. "We are not thieves. We will not become what they accused you of being." She couldn't let someone burn to death just to protect herself. That would make her as bad as the people who had condemned her. Helen pulled her coat tight around her face, covering everything but her eyes, and ran toward the bank. Several people shouted at her to stop, but she ignored them. The heat was intense, waves of it hitting her like physical blows. She ducked through the side door, the one the employees used, and immediately started choking on thick, acrid smoke. The interior was an inferno. Flames crawled up the walls and across the ceiling. The heat was so intense, it felt like her skin was blistering. She dropped low where the air was slightly clearer and called out, "Where are you? Call out if you can hear me." A weak cough answered her from deeper in the building. Helen crawled forward, her eyes streaming, her lungs burning. She found him behind the counter, an elderly man in a bank clerk's uniform, unconscious and barely breathing. She recognized him as Mr. Fenwick, who had worked at the bank for as long as she could remember. Helen grabbed him under the arms and dragged him toward the door. He was heavier than he looked, and the smoke made it hard to see or breathe. Flames blocked their original path, forcing her to veer toward a window instead. She picked up a heavy ledger from the floor and hurled it through the glass. Fresh air rushed in, feeding the fire but giving her a path out. She pushed Mr. Fenwick through first, then climbed out after him, falling onto the ground outside. Strong hands grabbed her, pulling both her and the clerk away from the building. "Someone get the doctor." A voice shouted. Helen lay on the cold ground, coughing violently, her lungs screaming. People swarmed around them, but she forced herself to her feet. She had to leave before anyone recognized her. "Wait!" Someone called out. "You saved Fenwick. Who are you?" But Helen was already running, disappearing into the crowd and then into the trees beyond. Behind her, she heard confused voices, questions, speculation. But she didn't stop until she was far from town, deep in the safety of the forest. Only then did she collapse against a tree, her whole body shaking. Her hands were burned, her coat was singed, and her lungs felt like they'd been scoured with sand. But she was alive, and so was Mr. Fenwick. And clutched in her burned hand, grabbed instinctively as she dragged the clerk to safety, was a partially charred ledger from the bank. A ledger that might contain the very evidence Marcus Webb had tried to destroy. Helen made it back to the cave just as darkness fell. Her lungs still raw from smoke, her hands blistered and aching. She collapsed inside, coughing violently, and it took several minutes before she could breathe without pain shooting through her chest. When she finally caught her breath, she examined what she'd grabbed from the burning bank. The ledger was damaged, its leather cover scorched black and several pages burned beyond recognition. But the center pages had survived, protected by the outer layers. She opened it carefully, squinting in the firelight to read the entries. Her heart began to race. The ledger documented transactions from the past 6 months, and several entries were marked with Marcus Webb's initials. Large sums had been withdrawn from various accounts, always in amounts small enough not to raise immediate suspicion. $20 here, $30 there, $50 from another account. But when Helen added them up, the total was staggering. Over $2,000 had been systematically stolen. More importantly, the dates of these withdrawals corresponded almost exactly with the dates in Daniel's gambling ledger. Marcus had been stealing from the bank to cover Daniel's debts, just as they'd admitted in their conversation. This ledger was proof, but it was also incomplete. Many pages were destroyed, and without the full accounting books, a clever lawyer could argue the ledger had been doctored or taken out of context. She needed more. Helen carefully wrapped the ledger in oilcloth and hid it in a crevice at the back of the cave. Then she lay down by the fire, her body exhausted but her mind racing. Marcus had burned the bank to destroy evidence. That meant he knew someone was investigating, which meant he was getting desperate. Desperate men were dangerous. She must have fallen asleep despite her racing thoughts, because when she woke, sunlight was streaming into the cave and Pohibi was crouched beside the fire. Watching her with concern, "You have been injured," he said, gesturing to her burned hands and singed clothing. Helen sat up quickly, wincing at the pain. "You're back early." "It's only been 3 days. I rode through the night," Pohibi replied. "I found the marshal in Denver and told him about the bank. He is gathering a deputy and will arrive in Ashford Crossing tomorrow to conduct an investigation. But that is not why I hurried back. What happened? On my return, I stopped in Copper Ridge, a town 1 day north of here. The marshal there told me that Marcus Webb has put out word that he is looking for a Comanche man seen near Ashford Crossing. He is offering a reward of $100 for information." Helen's stomach dropped. "He knows you're helping me. Perhaps. Or perhaps he is simply trying to find anyone who might be investigating him," Pohibi said. "Either way, it is no longer safe for me to move freely. Which is why you need to tell me what happened while I was gone and why you smell of smoke." Helen told him everything. The fire at the bank, the man trapped inside, her impulsive decision to rescue him, and the ledger she had recovered. As she spoke, Pohibi's expression grew increasingly grave. "You saved a life," he said when she finished. That was honorable. But you also revealed that someone is actively working against Marcus and Daniel. They will be hunting for you now, I know, Helen admitted. But I couldn't let Mr. Fenwick die. And look what we have now. She retrieved the ledger and showed him the entries. This proves Marcus was stealing from the bank. Combined with Daniel's gambling records, we can connect everything. Puhibi examined the ledger carefully. The marshal will want to see this. But we have a problem. The bank has burned. Any other records that might have corroborated this ledger are now ash. A good lawyer could argue this single book proves nothing. Then what do we do? Helen asked, frustration creeping into her voice. We have evidence, but not enough. We have testimony we overheard, but no one will believe us. How do we make them pay for what they've done? Puhibi was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire. Finally, he spoke. We need them to confess. Not in private, where only we can hear, but publicly. In front of witnesses who cannot be dismissed or ignored. How do we make that happen? By giving them what they want, Puhibi said slowly, a plan forming in his mind. They think someone is blackmailing them. They are waiting for demands. So we give them demands. We arrange a meeting somewhere public enough that we can have witnesses hidden, but private enough that they will feel safe speaking freely. Helen considered this. The old mill, she said suddenly. On the north edge of town. It's been abandoned for years, but it's close enough that we could have people positioned nearby to overhear. And there's only one entrance, so Daniel and Marcus would feel like they could control the situation. Who would they be meeting? Puhibi asked. Me, Helen said firmly. No, Puhibi shook his head. That is too dangerous. The moment they see you, they will know you survived. They will try to kill you on sight. Not if I have leverage, Helen countered. Not if they think I have evidence hidden somewhere that will be revealed if anything happens to me. We send them a message. Tell them I have Daniel's journal, Marcus's letter, and the bank ledger. Tell them I want money to disappear, and in exchange, I'll give them everything and never speak of it again. They will not honor such a deal, Puhibi warned. They will take the evidence and kill you anyway. I know, Helen said. But they'll want to know if there are copies first. They'll want to question me, find out who else knows. And while they're talking, while they're confessing to everything they've done, the territorial marshal and his deputy will be listening from the next room. Puhibi studied her face, seeing the determination there. You have changed much since I found you, he observed. You are no longer afraid. Oh, I'm terrified, Helen admitted. But I'm more angry than afraid. And I'm tired of hiding. I want my life back. I want my name back. And I want them to face what they've done. If this goes wrong, Puhibi said quietly, you could die. I could have died a dozen times already, Helen replied. In the forest. In the fire. Every day I've been out here. But I'm still alive. And I'm going to stay alive long enough to see justice done. Puhibi nodded slowly. Then we will need the marshal's cooperation. And we will need to plan very carefully. No mistakes. No hesitation. They spent the rest of the day and into the night working out every detail. The message would be delivered to Daniel's room again, this time with specific instructions. Meet at the old mill at midnight 2 days from now. Come alone, bring $500, and be prepared to negotiate. The message would be signed simply, HC, letting them guess who it was from. The next morning, Puhibi rode out before dawn to intercept the territorial marshal on the road to Ashford Crossing. Helen waited at the cave, practicing what she would say, preparing herself mentally for the confrontation to come. Puhibi returned that evening with news. Marshal Thomas Garrett had agreed to the plan. He would arrive in Ashford Crossing the day of the meeting, quietly, and position himself in the mill's storage room with his deputy. They would witness everything and intervene only if Helen's life was in immediate danger. "He wants to meet you first," Puhibi said, "to hear your story directly and see the evidence we have gathered." That night, under cover of darkness, Helen and Puhibi met the marshal at a location well outside of town. Marshal Garrett was a weathered man in his 50s with steel-gray hair and eyes that missed nothing. He listened without interruption as Helen told him everything. From the false accusations to the branding. From the evidence they'd found to the conversations they'd overheard. When she finished, the marshal examined the bank ledger and the notes they'd made about Daniel's journal and Marcus's letter. "This is substantial," he said finally. "But you're right that it's not quite enough for a conviction. The ledger alone could be explained away. We need their confession. Will you testify to what you hear in the mill?" Helen asked. "I will," Marshal Garrett confirmed. "And so will my deputy." 2 law enforcement officers witnessing a confession carries considerable weight. "But Miss Carver, you understand the risk you're taking? These men have already proven they're willing to commit violence. If they realize it's a trap, I understand," Helen said. "But I'm doing this anyway." The marshal studied her for a moment, then nodded with something like respect. "You're braver than most men I know. All right, we'll do this your way. But I want you to know, if things go south, my first priority is keeping you alive. Justice is important, but not more important than your life." "Agreed," Helen said, though privately she wasn't sure she believed it. The message was delivered to Daniel's room that night. Puhibi slipped in and out like a ghost, leaving the note on Daniel's pillow where he couldn't miss it. Then they waited. The next 2 days crawled by with agonizing slowness. Helen checked and rechecked her plans, going over every possible scenario in her mind. Puhibi taught her basic self-defense techniques, showing her how to break a grip and where to strike if she needed to fight. The marshal and his deputy positioned themselves in town, posing as traveling merchants while they scouted the old mill and planned their positions. Finally, the night of the meeting arrived. Helen dressed in the clothes Puhibi's sister had worn, practical and dark. She braided her hair tightly and tucked it under a hat. The brand on her shoulder throbbed as if sensing what was coming. She wrapped it with extra cloth to hide it, though she knew that if things went according to plan, everyone would see it soon enough. "Last chance to change your mind," Puhibi said as they prepared to leave the cave. "I'm not changing my mind," Helen replied, checking the small knife he'd insisted she carry in her boot. "Let's finish this." They arrived at the mill an hour before midnight. The building was a skeletal structure of rotting wood and broken windows, illuminated only by pale moonlight filtering through the clouds. Marshal Garrett and his deputy were already positioned in the storage room, hidden behind a false wall that had a gap just wide enough to see and hear through. "Remember," the marshal whispered to Helen before concealing himself. "Keep them talking. Get them to admit what they did. And if anything goes wrong, the deputy will fire a warning shot." "That's your signal to run," Helen nodded, her heart pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. Puhibi had wanted to stay close by, but Helen had insisted he keep his distance. If Marcus had indeed put out word about a Comanche helping her, Puhibi's presence would give everything away. He was positioned in the trees 100 yards away, ready to intervene if necessary, but otherwise staying hidden. Helen stood in the center of the mill's main room, near an old table that had somehow survived years of abandonment. She had placed a lantern there, its light casting long shadows across the broken floor. In her pocket, she carried copies of the evidence they'd gathered, carefully transcribed by the marshal's deputy. The originals were safely hidden. Footsteps approached outside. Helen's breath caught. This was it. No turning back now. The door creaked open, and Daniel Ashford stepped inside, followed closely by Marcus Webb. Both men carried guns, and both looked around nervously before their eyes settled on Helen. For a long moment, nobody spoke. Daniel's face went through a series of emotions: confusion, recognition, shock, and finally fury. "You," he breathed. "You're supposed to be dead." Helen stood perfectly still, keeping her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her. "Disappointed?" Marcus moved forward, his hand on his gun. "How did you survive? You had nothing. No food, no shelter. You should have frozen to death days ago." "Clearly, I'm harder to kill than you thought," Helen replied. "Did you bring the money?" Daniel laughed, a harsh, bitter sound. "You think we're actually going to pay you? You think we're that stupid?" "I think you're desperate," Helen said calmly. "I think you know the territorial marshal is in town asking questions about the bank fire. I think you know your time is running out. And I think you'd rather pay me $500 than spend the next 20 years in prison." Marcus and Daniel exchanged glances. "You said you have evidence," Marcus said. "Daniel's journal. My letter, the bank ledger. I want to see them." "First, let's be clear about what we're discussing," Helen said, forcing them to spell it out. "You want the journal where Daniel recorded all his gambling debts and the items he stole to pay them. You want the letter where you, Marcus, explicitly told Daniel to frame me for the thefts. And you want the ledger showing how you embezzled money from your father's bank to cover Daniel's losses. Is that correct?" "You don't have any of that," Daniel scoffed. "You're bluffing." Helen pulled out the copies from her pocket and read aloud. "September 15th, lost 200 at cards to Collins. Took the Holbrook brooch to settle the debt. October 3rd, Marcus fronted me 100 from the bank accounts. Pawned the Meyer watch for the rest." She looked up. "Should I continue?" Daniel's face had gone pale. "How did you get into my room?" he demanded. "The same way I got in to leave you that note," Helen replied. "The same way I've been watching both of you for the past week. Did you really think I was going to just disappear after what you did to me?" She turned to Marcus. "And your letter was particularly damning. The servant girl is an easy target. No family, no connections. Who would believe her over you? That's what you wrote." Those exact words. Marcus's hand tightened on his gun. "Where are the originals?" "Safe," Helen said, "with instructions to deliver them to the authorities if anything happens to me. So if you're thinking about shooting me right now, you should know that won't solve your problem. It'll only make it worse. We could make you tell us." Daniel threatened, stepping closer. "You could try," Helen agreed. "But I've already been branded and left for dead by this town. What else can you do to me that's worse than that? Meanwhile, every minute you waste threatening me is another minute closer to the marshal finding evidence you missed in the bank fire." "That stopped them," Marcus spoke up, his voice carefully controlled. "Let's say we believe you have this evidence. Let's say we're willing to negotiate. What exactly do you want?" This was it. The moment where she needed to get them to confess everything. "I want money to disappear. 500 to start, more later to keep me comfortable," Helen said. "But first, I need to know I'm dealing with the real criminals here. I need you to admit what you did. All of it. The thefts, the frame-up, the embezzlement, everything. I need to hear you say it. Because if I'm going to spend the rest of my life keeping your secrets, I need to know exactly what those secrets are." Daniel laughed again, but there was an edge of hysteria to it now. "You want us to confess? Right here, right now? Unless you want me to walk out of here and take this evidence straight to Marshal Garrett." Helen replied. Marcus grabbed Daniel's arm, pulling him back. They had a whispered argument that Helen couldn't quite hear, but she could see Marcus was winning. Finally, they turned back to her. "Fine," Marcus said through gritted teeth. "Yes, Daniel stole items from various homes in town. He had gambling debts he couldn't pay. I loaned him money from the bank to help cover those debts, money I took from dormant accounts that my father rarely checked. When my father started asking questions, we needed a distraction. Something that would occupy everyone's attention while we covered our tracks. So you framed me, Helen said, keeping him talking. So we used you, Marcus corrected coldly. You were perfect for it. No family, no friends, no one who would ask too many questions. Daniel planted the stolen items in your room while you slept. We knew when they were found, you'd be blamed. We knew the town would turn on you. And we knew once you were branded and exiled, no one would believe anything you said even if you did survive, which you shouldn't have, Daniel added with venom. You should be dead. How the hell did you survive out there? That's not important, Helen said, her voice shaking now with genuine emotion. What's important is that you destroyed my life to save yourselves. You had me tortured in front of the entire town. You marked me as a criminal when you knew I was innocent. And when that wasn't enough, Marcus, you burned down the bank and would have let Mr. Fenwick die just to destroy evidence of your crimes. I didn't know Fenwick was in there, Marcus protested, then seemed to realize what he'd admitted. But you did set the fire, Helen pressed. Marcus's eyes narrowed. This isn't a negotiation anymore. This is an interrogation. Who else is listening? He drew his gun fully now, pointing it directly at Helen. Nobody, Helen said, taking a step back. I'm alone, liar, Marcus snarled. You're too calm. Too prepared. Someone put you up to this, behind the false wall. Helen heard the subtle sound of Marshal Garrett, preparing to intervene. But before anyone could move, the mill's main door flew open, and Puhibi strode in. His bow drawn with an arrow nocked and aimed directly at Marcus's heart. Put down the gun, Puhibi commanded, his voice deadly calm. Marcus spun toward this new threat, and chaos erupted. Everything happened in seconds. Marcus swung his gun toward Puhibi, but before he could fire, Marshal Garrett burst through the false wall with his deputy right behind him, both with weapons drawn. Drop it! Territorial Marshal! Garrett's voice thundered through the old mill. Daniel froze, his hands shooting up instinctively. But Marcus, cornered and desperate, grabbed Helen, yanking her in front of him as a shield, pressing his gun to her temple. Stay back! Marcus shouted, his voice cracking with panic. I'll kill her. I swear I'll do it. Helen's heart hammered against her ribs, but she forced herself to stay still. She could feel the cold metal of the gun barrel against her skin, could smell Marcus's fierce sweat. It's over, Webb, Marshal Garrett said, moving slowly into better position. We heard everything. Your confession, Daniel's admission. You're both under arrest for theft, embezzlement, arson, and conspiracy to commit fraud. You can't prove anything, Marcus said, though his grip on Helen was shaking now. It'll be your word against ours. My father owns half this territory. We'll walk free. Your father doesn't own me, the marshal replied coldly. And I've got 2 witnesses to your confession, plus physical evidence. The game's done. Puhibi hadn't lowered his bow. His arrow remained trained on Marcus, waiting for the slightest opening. Helen could see him in her peripheral vision, absolutely motionless, barely breathing. Let her go, Daniel said suddenly, his voice hollow. Marcus, it's finished. Let her go. Shut up. Marcus snarled at his accomplice. This is your fault. Your gambling, your debts, your stupidity. I should have let you drown in it instead of trying to help you. Help me. Daniel's laugh was bitter. You used my debts as an excuse to steal from your own father. You wanted that money just as much as I needed it. The partnership was fracturing, each man turning on the other now that capture was inevitable. Both of you need to calm down, Marshal Garrett said firmly. Webb, you let Miss Carver go right now, and I'll make sure the judge knows you cooperated. Keep this up, and you're looking at attempted murder on top of everything else. Marcus's breathing was ragged against Helen's ear. She could feel him calculating, trying to find a way out that didn't exist. His grip loosened slightly just for a moment. It was enough. Helen drove her elbow back into Marcus's ribs with all her strength, exactly as Puhibi had taught her. Marcus gasped and stumbled, his gun swinging away from her head. In that instant, Puhibi's arrow flew, striking Marcus's gun hand. The weapon clattered to the floor as Marcus screamed in pain. The deputy rushed forward, tackling Marcus to the ground and wrenching his arms behind his back. Marshal Garrett had Daniel in custody within seconds, iron shackles clicking into place around both men's wrists. Helen stood in the center of the mill, breathing hard, her legs shaking so badly she thought she might collapse. Puhibi was at her side immediately, his hand on her shoulder. "It is done," he said quietly. "You are safe now." Marshal Garrett approached them, his weathered face showing something like admiration. "Miss Carver, that was either the bravest or the most foolish thing I've seen in 20 years of law work." "Possibly both. Did you hear enough?" Helen asked, her voice unsteady. "Can you make the charges stick?" "Every word," the marshal confirmed. "They confessed to multiple felonies in front of 2 officers of the territorial court. Combined with the evidence you gathered, they're going to prison for a long time." Daniel had slumped to the floor, his face in his hands. Marcus was still cursing and struggling against the deputy's hold, blood dripping from his arrow-pierced hand. Neither of them looked like the confident, privileged men who had destroyed Helen's life. They looked small and pathetic. The next morning, the entire town was summoned to the church by the ringing of the bell, the same bell that had marked the beginning of Helen's nightmare. They came reluctantly, confused by the early hour and the presence of the territorial marshal's horses tied outside. Inside, Marshal Garrett stood at the pulpit with his deputy. Helen sat in the front pew beside Puhibi, her heart pounding as she faced the people who had condemned her. She saw Mayor Ashford, his face gray with shock at seeing his son in chains. She saw Mrs. Holbrook and Mrs. Meyer, the women whose stolen items had been the catalyst for everything. She saw Father Mulligan, Mrs. Patterson, Thomas Greer, all the people who had watched her be branded and done nothing. Garrett Moss was there too, the blacksmith who had pressed the iron to her flesh. When his eyes met Helen's, he looked away quickly. Marshal Garrett spoke with the authority of the law behind him. He detailed the investigation, the evidence, and most damning of all, the full confession he and his deputy had witnessed. He explained how Daniel Ashford and Marcus Webb had systematically stolen from their neighbors, then framed an innocent woman to cover their crimes. "Helen Carver is innocent of all charges," the marshal declared. "She was falsely accused, brutally punished, and exiled for crimes she did not commit. The real criminals are in custody and will face justice. But this town owes Miss Carver more than an apology. You owe her restitution for what you did to her." The church erupted in shocked murmurs. Mayor Ashford stood, his face contorted with anguish and fury. "This is impossible. My son wouldn't." "Your son confessed, Mayor," Garrett cut him off. "As did Marcus Webb. I heard them both with my own ears. And Miss Carver nearly died proving what your town refused to see, that she was innocent all along." The mayor's legs seemed to give out. He sat down heavily, suddenly looking decades older. Mrs. Holbrook stood next, tears streaming down her face. "Helen, I'm so sorry. We should have listened. We should have questioned. I don't expect you to forgive us, but please know that I am deeply, deeply ashamed." Other voices joined hers, some apologizing, some still skeptical, some simply shocked into silence. Helen sat through it all, feeling strangely detached. These apologies, however sincere, couldn't undo what had been done, couldn't erase the brand on her shoulder or the weeks of suffering in the wilderness. Finally, she stood. The church fell silent. "I don't know if I can forgive this town," Helen said, her voice steady despite the emotion churning inside her. "You branded me. You cast me out to die. And not one of you stopped to ask if maybe, just maybe, you were wrong. You were so certain of my guilt that you didn't need proof. You didn't need truth. You just needed someone to punish." She turned to face Garrett Moss directly. "You held the iron. You burned that word into my skin. Can you even imagine what that feels like? To have your identity, your humanity, reduced to a single word carved in pain? Moss couldn't meet her eyes. "I was following orders," he whispered. "That's what evil people always say," Helen replied. "But you had a choice. Everyone in this room had a choice. And you all chose cruelty over compassion, certainty over doubt, convenience over justice." She looked around the church, meeting as many eyes as she could. "I survived because one person chose differently. One person saw what happened and decided to help, not because he owed me anything, but because it was right. Puhibi Wolfhart saved my life and helped me find the truth. A Comanche man showed me more Christian charity than any of you did." That landed hard. Several people had the grace to look ashamed. Father Mulligan stood, his voice heavy with sorrow. "You're right, Helen. We failed you in every way that matters. I don't ask for your forgiveness, but I do ask that you tell us what we can do to make even a small amends." Helen was quiet for a long moment. Finally she said, "Compensation for the months of work I'll never be paid for. Medical treatment for my injuries. And a public retraction of the accusations, published in every newspaper in the territory, so that wherever I go, people will know I was innocent." "Done," Marshal Garrett said immediately. "I'll see to it personally. And the town will pay. There's one more thing," Helen added. "Puhibi Wolfhart should be compensated as well. He risked his life to help me, and Marcus Webb put a bounty on him. He deserves recognition and payment." The marshal nodded. "Agreed. The territorial government offers rewards for assistance in major criminal investigations. Mr. Wolf, Hart certainly qualifies." Puhibi had said nothing through all of this. Sitting quietly beside Helen, now he spoke, his voice calm and measured. "I do not want payment. I helped because it was right. That is enough. Nevertheless, you've earned it," the marshal insisted. The meeting ended shortly after. Daniel and Marcus were loaded into a reinforced wagon for transport to Denver. Mayor Ashford resigned his position on the spot, unable to face the shame of his son's crimes. But Helen found she didn't want to stay in Ashford Crossing any longer than necessary. Too much pain was soaked into this place. 3 days later, Helen stood at the edge of town one final time. She was dressed in new clothes, proper riding gear purchased with an advance on her compensation. The brand on her shoulder would never fully heal, but at least now it came with a story of survival rather than shame. Puhibi waited beside her with 2 horses. Supplies packed for a long journey. "You're sure about this?" Marshal Garrett asked, having come to see them off. "You could stay. Build a new life here. I don't want a life built on their guilt," Helen replied. "I want to go somewhere no one knows what happened. Somewhere I can just be Helen." The marshal handed her a sealed envelope. "Your compensation and the official documentation clearing your name. There's also a letter of reference from me. Thank you," Helen said sincerely. "For believing me. For helping me prove the truth." "You did that yourself, Miss Carver," Garrett replied. "You take care now." Helen and Puhibi mounted their horses. As they rode away from Ashford Crossing, Helen didn't look back. That chapter of her life was closed. Ahead lay open territory, new possibilities, and the chance to build something better. "Where will you go?" Puhibi asked as they followed the trail westward. "I don't know yet," Helen admitted. "Maybe Denver. Maybe further. What about you?" "I thought I might travel with you for a while," Puhibi said. "If you do not mind the company. The mountains will still be there when I return." Helen smiled, the first genuine smile that had touched her face in months. "I'd like that. I'd like that very much." They rode in comfortable silence as the morning sun climbed higher, warming the frost-covered land. Behind them, Ashford Crossing grew smaller and smaller until it disappeared entirely. Ahead, the future stretched out uncertain but full of promise. Helen Carver had been marked as a criminal, tortured, exiled, and left for dead. But she had survived. She had fought back. She had reclaimed her name and her truth. And now, with the open road before her and an unexpected friend at her side, she was finally free. The word branded into her shoulder would always be there, a permanent reminder of injustice. But Helen had learned that she was so much more than what others tried to make her. She was strong. She was brave. She was a survivor, and that was a truth no brand could ever erase.
Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.